Good afternoon. Thank you for attending this evening's Janus Forum, sponsored by the Political Theory Project here at Brown University. My name is Dan D'Amico. I'm the Associate Director at the PTP, and I'll serve as tonight's Master of Ceremony, so to speak. I'd like to begin with a brief description of the Political Theory Project and the uniqueness of our Janus Forum program series. Our mission at the PTP is to invigorate the study of ideas and institutions that make societies free, prosperous, and fair. Secondly, we aim for all of our programming to promote interdisciplinary methods and ideological pluralism. But what does that mean? In short, we want to bring together individuals from different subject fields, different identities, and different value systems to think and discuss the most pressing social issues of our time. Very smart people often disagree. Janus Forum lectures such as this one provide an event space where members of the Brown community can engage alternative intellectual perspectives in their most sophisticated presentations by top scholars and in direct comparison to one another. In past semesters, we've hosted similar discussions surrounding global economic development, domestic inequality, the viabilities of socialism, and immigration. Such conversations showcased tangible disagreements in theory, evidence, and inference. But this semester, we have taken a strong turn towards the practical. Today, we are joined by two scholars whose research and professional experiences are at the literal front lines of economic and public policy analysis. Professor Glaeser's work has made substantial contributions in the way we understand industrial organization, functional urban infrastructure, and urban economic development. In kind, Professor Goolsbee's work highlights the potentials of specific public policies amidst our rapidly changing social, cultural, and economic conditions. Our title for this evening has been set as Urban Policy in the 21st Century, Desperate Times, Desperate Measures, ? In the wake of the Great Recession, the American economy today confronts a variety of seemingly unique challenges: stagnant middle-class wages, increased inequality, globalized markets, outsourcing, and automation have all inspired a deep sense of anxiety and urgency in the American public and experts alike. Terms like democratic socialism and proposals like universal basic income would have seemed beyond the pale of political discourse just a few years back. Yet today, they've gained significant traction. How unique are today's social circumstances, and what forms of real public policies offer hopes for guiding and maintaining economic performance as we proceed throughout the 21st century? The format for tonight's event is straightforward. Each presenter, beginning with Professor Glaeser, will discuss the motivations and findings of their research for approximately 30 minutes. Following both presentations, we'll have an equal period of time for questions and answers from the audience. Thereafter, we'll conclude our moderated discussion in the lobby for a brief reception. I hope you all enjoy hearing from our guest researchers and take note to attend future programs hosted by the Political Theory Project. Be sure to follow us on Facebook. I'll now introduce our first presenter. Edward Glaeser is the Fred and Eleanor Glimp Professor of Economics in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Harvard University, where he has taught since 1992. He regularly teaches microeconomic theory and occasionally urban and public economics. He has served as director of the Taubman Center for State and Local Government and director of the Rappaport Institute for Greater Boston. He has published dozens of papers on cities, economic growth, law, and economics. In particular, his work is focused on the determinants of city growth and the role of cities as centers of idea transmission. He received his PhD from the University of Chicago in 1992, and his books include Cities, Agglomeration, and Spatial Equilibrium, published by Oxford University Press. Please join me in welcoming Professor Edward Glaeser.
Let's see if I can get this back up. Great. Okay. So I wish I was sort of so grandly debating the frontiers of socialism and capitalism. I'm going to be talking about buses. So just to make sure you have your focus on what to expect. So I think as needed background, humankind goes through these waves. Technological trends are centrifugal, meaning they're pushing people away from cities, and centripetal, pulling people towards cities. And the past 30 years has been a relatively centripetal age, right? Cities have done, not every city, but many cities have done relatively well. And this is one way of at least seeing this in the US. What I've done here is I've taken the 3,000 odd counties in the United States, and I've ordered them on the basis of their density level. Because at their hearts, cities are the absence of physical space between people. Cities are density, proximity, closeness. Each one of these dots represents 1/10 of America's counties, about 300 of them. 1/10 of America's counties, approximately 300 of them. And the bottom line shows the relationship between income and density across America. The densest 10th of America's counties have incomes that are on average 50% higher than the least dense half of America's counties. This is something economists call agglomeration economies, and there are many different issues around interpreting this as being a treatment effect of density. But I think it's fair to say that the weight of academic opinion suggests that at least some part of this is treatment. The top line may be somewhat more surprising to you, which is the relationship between population growth and density. So the places that started with the most crowding ended up getting even more crowded over the 2000 to 2010 people. And this is very different from the US at the start of the 19th century, when we were leaving our dense enclaves on the eastern seaboard to populate the empty spaces between the oceans. At the start of the 21st century, instead of spreading out, we are clustering in. This is a centripetal age. This is housing prices. So we have been in the midst of a great housing price convulsion between 2000 and 2011. But if you take over the entire 1996 to 2012 period, you see that almost all of the housing price appreciation is in those metropolitan areas that are the densest. And that's what you're looking at here, again, suggesting this demand for proximity. This is another way of seeing this. So this is price growth and proximity to the city center. So along the x-axis here is distance to what's called the central business district, but think of that as the heart of the city. Between 1996 and 2015, there's been a big tilt up, where suburban homes have done much less well than homes at the city center. Now, this is a phenomenon that's not particular to the US. It's true in most of the wealthy world, but even larger transformations are happening in the developing world. And we reached this in 2007, the United Nations told us that we became a majority urban species. It's hard not to think that on net, that's a good thing, because when you compare those countries that are more than 50% urbanized to those countries that are less than 50% urbanized, the more urbanized countries have on average incomes that are 5 times as high and infant mortality levels that are less than 1/3. But of course, urbanization is not an unmixed blessing. There are also demons that come with density: contagious disease, crime, traffic congestion, high housing prices. And those demons become more acute, more problematic when countries have limited resources and limited public capacity to handle it. And this is just one way of seeing this transformation, that, this is the share of countries in these different income brackets that were more than 1/3 urban in 1960 and today. Basically no change in 1960, if anything, a slight decline between 3,000 and 4,000. But ask yourself, what share of countries with per capita incomes below $1,000 were more than 1/3 urban in 1960? It's a really easy number to remember. It's 0. Because in 1960, it had been true throughout almost all of recorded history, to be poor was to be rural. Today, more than 40% of the world's poorest countries are more than 1/3 urban. And we see the rise of megacities like Kinshasa and Karachi, in places that are both poor and too often poorly governed. And that is indeed, even though this has nothing to do with the question of American urban policy in the 21st century, it is in fact one of the world's greatest challenges in the 21st century. And anytime I have a room where there are people under the age of 30 who may be thinking about their futures, I can't resist the impulse to say that trying to make the cities of the developing world more livable is one of the great vocations of the 21st century. Okay, now this is the centrifugal age that I grew up in, right? New York in the 1970s had been hemorrhaging manufacturing jobs. The largest industrial concentration in the United States in the 1950s was not automobile production in Detroit. It was garment production in New York City. It was an industrial cluster that lost hundreds of thousands of jobs in a few short years. And indeed, by the 1970s, it really seemed as if the age of the city had come and gone and was not to return. The fact that this did not continue, the fact that many cities managed to reinvent itself, is one of the great miracles of our age. And the theme that I'm going to push on this, and I think it helps explain the next facts, is that what happened is that globalization and new technologies radically increased returns to being smart. And we are a social species that becomes smart by being around other smart people. That helps to explain why cities cities that are skilled have done much better than cities that are unskilled, why some areas have succeeded and others have not. And it also helps to guide much of what faces us in terms of urban policy. So when talking about urban policy, I'm going to talk about 5 buckets. I'm going to talk about education and opportunity, which in terms of the challenge of urban inequality, which has always been with us, right? I mean, it was Plato who wrote 2,400 years ago that every city of whatever size is in reality 2 cities, one a city of the rich, one a city of the poor. I am big on the view that cities should never apologize for their inequality, just as suburbs that zone out poverty should never be proud of the fact that they look equal. Cities have rich and poor people because they provide a place to live for people with less income and some ability to move up. That being said, urban inequality is a huge challenge, and it's one that we have to face. I will take the view, which is not unusual in economists, that one major part of that has to be education. I don't think Austan is likely to disagree with me on this very much, and so I'm going to go over it quickly. I will then say something about entrepreneurship, again, which I think is incredibly important, but one in which, again, I would be very surprised if Austan decides to take major issue. If anything, he'll probably have smart things to say, and I'll probably agree with him. The areas in which we're most likely to disagree are infrastructure, where I will spend more time because I think it's the area in which we're likely to have the most disagreement. But luckily, we have America's greatest transportation economist, Matt Turner, is in the room, so Matt can adjudicate anything that we have on this issue. And then I'll talk a little bit about housing, and then some new work of mine with Larry Summers and Ben Austan on encouraging employment in places that actually have not experienced this urban success. So education and opportunity. This is the difference this is the relationship between GDP per capita and share of the population with a college degree across America's metropolitan areas. The heterogeneity is daunting, and the relationship with skills is enormous. Right? It is very hard to take away from this that education is not incredibly important, both at the individual level but also at the city level. You want to understand why Detroit looks different from Seattle. More than 1/2 of Seattle's adults have college degrees. About 1 in 8 of Detroit's adults have college degrees. This is the relationship between population growth and share of the population with a college degree in 2000. Again, these are strong, robust facts. So my 2 cents on education. There's a limited set of evidence that just spending more is probably not very effective. This goes back to the work of Eric Hanashek. So we need to be smart in figuring out how to spend more. Charter schools appear to be effective in highly regulated environments. The Josh Anger's work in the Boston metropolitan area shows a fair amount of positive success, but far more mixed results elsewhere. And some of the work of Roland Fryer in charter schools in Texas suggests that even when they do raise test scores, they may not raise earnings. And I think we need to know more about this. There seems to be fairly universal support for improved forms of pre-K education. This, of course, goes back to the work on Perry Preschool and the Abecedarian program. I've got nothing new to say about that. There's a renewed burst of anti-education enthusiasm, partially associated with Brian Kaplan, and I think it's right for us to worry about all the stupid things that get done in schools, but I think that's in no sense it remains true that fat, drunk, and stupid is no way to go through life, son, as they said famously in Animal House, and there's no future in ignorance. So the right answer is to make our schools better rather than to try and shut them down. There's also a vogue for vocational training, which I think is assuredly right, particularly as a complement rather than as a substitute, to try and figure out how to educate people more. I think we need to approach this with humility and recognize we don't know what works, and to try and constantly innovate using wraparound forms of vocational training, which we then evaluate using randomized controlled trials, do more of what works and do less of what doesn't work. And there's a particularly clear need, when I think about the problems that cities labor under, the fact that so many adults feel that they have to leave urban areas to get decent schooling for their kids is the largest curse that many of our cities face. And I want to remind you that this is not normal in the urban world. No French person has ever thought that they need to leave Paris to get better schools for their kids. No Englishman has ever thought he needs to leave London to get better schools for his kids. This is an American phenomenon. It has to do with the way that we've set up local schooling. And anything that we can do that pushes back on that would at least be somewhat helpful for cities. Okay, I tend to view urban entrepreneurship as just another form of human capital. 50 years ago, the economist Ben Chinitz was comparing New York and Pittsburgh and noted that New York appeared to be more resilient than Pittsburgh did even then. He argued that this was a legacy of Pittsburgh and New York's industrial past, where New York's garment industry, which was an industry with very weak returns to scale and very few barriers to entry, was a mother of entrepreneurship that trained people who then went on to do different things. People who started in the garment trade then built skyscrapers or founded banks or opened movie studios, right? That human capital was enormously helpful for New York reinventing itself. By contrast, Pittsburgh had U.S. Steel and U.S. Steel trained company men who were not very good at reinventing themselves. It is amazing, given how mediocre our measures of entrepreneurship, that they do such a good job of predicting urban success. We typically measure entrepreneurship at the local level either by the share of employment in new startups or by just average establishment size. That's what you're seeing here. Those places with small average establishments have had much faster growth than those places with big average establishments over the last 30 years. This is true within industry, within region of the country, any way you want to cut it, and there's a variety of different empirical strategies people use on this. Now, it's not obvious that we know how to inculcate entrepreneurship. We do know how to regulate it. And I'm going to skip over this story, but this is about Detroit artificially restricting entrepreneurship by making it very difficult for a woman to start a food truck in the area. And if you ask me during Q&A, I'll give you the anecdote on this. We also have an increased amount of state regulation in terms of occupational licensing. This shows the map of where we have regulation of opticians. And remember, opticians are not the guys who tell you what prescription you need. They tell you whether or not you should wear round glasses or square glasses. Not a very clear thing that you actually need to have regulated. So again, I don't think that Austan and I are going to disagree very much on this, so I'm going to move quickly. Right? We don't necessarily necessarily know how to inculcate entrepreneurial capital, but we do know how to regulate. We do know how to regulate out of existence. We regulate the entrepreneurship of rich people much more lightly than we regulate the entrepreneurship of poor people. It's easy to start your internet phenomenon in a brown dorm room, and no one starts to regulate it until you have 1 billion users and it possibly hacked an election, right? By contrast, if you wanted to start a grocery store somewhere in Providence, I don't know how many regulations literally you need here. In Boston, it's 17. Right, which is sort of an outrageous mismatch between making it difficult for poor people to start businesses versus rich people. I'm quite keen on promoting one-stop permitting, especially in poor areas, and requiring cost-benefit analysis more assiduously for local regulation. Just to be clear, this is nothing about regulation of financial industry issues or about public health-related industries. I'm just talking about sort of the extra burden that's been placed on small-scale entrepreneurs, where I think the case for regulating a little less is pretty clear. The case for infrastructure, I want to just make this point. Today, cities are actually remarkably healthy. Life expectancy in New York is about 3 years higher than it is elsewhere. That didn't happen easily. Traditionally, cities were killing fields. And a boy born in New York City in 1900 could expect to live about 7 years less than the national average, which is about the same life expectancy gap as in Shakespeare's London. That change didn't happen easily, as American cities and towns were spending as much on clean water in 1900 as the federal government was spending on everything except for the post office and the army. But it's not just about infrastructure. And I like making this point by showing here, I was raised on an engineering triumphalism story that New York was filthy until they opened the Croton Aqueduct and then New York got healthy. Now, you don't have to be a great time series econometrician to look at this and see that the Croton Aqueduct opening didn't immediately make cholera go away. In fact, my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather died in that one, and that was the 1849 cholera epidemic. And for 25 years, New York was still having cholera epidemics. And the reason for this was New York continued to have a last mile problem, that they built the infrastructure and they still expected poor families to pay for it, and they didn't create any regulations which pushed them to do it. Consequently, poor people didn't pay for the water, continue to use shallow wells, continue to use pit latrines, and continue to die from contagious diseases. We see the same issue in my work in Africa today. And it's not until 1866 when you actually start having regulations that actually push people to use the clean water infrastructure, to use the sewers, to use the water pipes, that New York actually starts seeing declines in mortality. The point of that is that you actually need both economics and engineering in order to make infrastructure work. Matt's work on the fundamental law of highway traffic shows that vehicle miles traveled increase roughly 1-for-1 with highway miles built. If you build it, they will drive it. Unless you have something that pushes back on people driving, you don't get infrastructure used properly. Singapore has had congestion pricing since 1975. It's the second densest country on the globe, and its roads move swiftly even during crowded time periods because they charge people for the social costs of their actions. When I think about technological innovations in the 21st century, it is hard for me to imagine a technological innovation that could do more harm than automated vehicles if they are not accompanied with congestion pricing. You're radically reducing the cost from sitting in traffic without, that's going to increase a flood of people willing to sit in traffic. The time for congestion pricing has to be now, has to be before they get normalized so everyone gets used to paying for it. Because if there's one thing we've learned from political economy in the US, people will accept a price if it comes with a new product, right? If you open a new road, it's okay to have a toll on it. If you try to take a service that was previously free and put a toll on it, it'll never happen, which is why the case for putting a price on a new service like automated vehicles is so strong to introduce the principle of paying for this. We have a long track record of fighting congestion charging. I think it's worthwhile moving past on that. And at the very least, there are many good reasons for having infrastructure paid for by its users, right? And this is my specifically picking a fight with Austan on this, since this happened on his watch. Although, as you can see, it didn't particularly happen on his watch. Actually, this is before your watch. You're not even responsible for this. But we do. It's still your fault, though. It was because people anticipated. But the Obama administration certainly didn't do anything to help on this. And of course, we understand the political economy of this. What this is, the share of roads that are paid for by user fees, that actually means the gas taxes. And the more that we pay for roads with general tax revenues rather than gas taxes or fees, the more, if you think about all the things that's wrong with that. So it's wrong in the fact that it doesn't charge people with the pollution they create. It's wrong because it doesn't charge them for the destruction of the roads that this creates. It's wrong because it's essentially a transfer of money from people who don't drive to people who do drive, that encourages people to drive longer distances, to use more energy, to live further away in ways that are, there's no social reason why you would particularly encourage this. For most forms of infrastructure, except for those that are specifically targeted towards the poor, there's no reason that this infrastructure shouldn't be paid for by the people who use it. One study showed that the average user of JFK Airport is about at least 5 times richer than the average American. Why in the world you should be taxing ordinary Americans to provide extra infrastructure for JFK makes absolutely no sense to me when there are perfectly good means of charging people who use that infrastructure. Okay, we build plenty of more roads, and we should be thinking about getting better usage of those roads through things like congestion fees rather than just building more stuff. We should be thinking about maintenance rather than new construction. Don Shoup is right that requiring free parking, requiring more parking is an absolutely crazy thing for us to do. There's no reason why we should fetishize this in urban planning. There's no reason why we shouldn't expect drivers to pay rather than to get free parking. And there's no reason we shouldn't. This one's directly on you, Austan. I'm going to score a major hit here. Because of Austin's own planning, because he did this, we also spent in the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, spending went disproportionately to low-density areas rather than to high-density areas, and that skew was quite strong. Austin had nothing to do with that. They followed the Federal Highway Trust Fund formula, which was the only way to get it through, but that formula strongly privileged the low-density parts of America over the high-density parts of America. That's another problem with thinking that the infrastructure spending is going to come from general tax revenues, that it then follows politics which inevitably privileges places that have a lot of senators per capita relative to places that are denser, whereas a general model which says that users pay for their own infrastructure makes a lot more sense. We also ended up spending in places that had shorter commutes rather than longer commutes for the same reason, and we didn't particularly target this spending on places that have low levels of unemployment. Again, this following the low density area ended up meaning that we spend in places that actually had lower employment rather than higher employment. There's a lot of evidence that supports the view that spending on maintenance makes a lot more sense than new construction in lots of areas. That should very much be a focus of any 21st century urban infrastructure strategy. Instead of thinking that we're going to follow shiny new projects, we need to have a renewed American focus on making sure that the potholes go away, that we actually do a better job of caring for things. And finally, in terms of the world of infrastructure, there's an old line that 40 years of transportation economics at Harvard can be boiled down to 4 words: bus good, train bad, okay? This is about costs, this is about flexibility, this is about matching America's level of development. This is not to say that improving the Northeast Corridor or Acela service is a bad thing. There is a specific part of America where actually upgrading that train infrastructure can actually make sense. But for most of America, we're just way too low density a country for trains to work the way that they do in Hong Kong. By contrast, buses are a fantastic technology that can constantly be innovated, can constantly be moved around, and we shouldn't treat it as the ugly stepchild of American transportation. But of course, what do we love? We love $100 billion projects, which, right. The work of Matt Kahn and Nate Baum-Snow shows that, in fact, when we did build subways after the Federal Highway Aid Act of 1973, they had very modest impacts on commuting. It's not as if people were desperate to have these trains and then all of a sudden they all shifted to trains. The share of mode use was actually very modest after these subways in places like Atlanta and so forth. So my infrastructure claims, our 21st century infrastructure policy means congestion pricing is vital, especially if we're going to have autonomous vehicles. We can't just build more. Move to user fee funded transportation is both fairer and less likely to encourage excessive suburbanization. There appears to be high returns to road and bridge maintenance, and the federal government could help to encourage that. And there's a far clearer case for upgrading the bus to provide mobility for the poor, and a far worse case for spending on high-speed rail. Okay. Housing. Okay. Housing is part of the big issue that surrounds us. And the big story in housing is not demand, but supply. This is a map of America where along the x-axis I have the amount of new building, permits issued between 2000 and 2013 over the 2000 housing stock. Along the y-axis I have prices, and this is sort of a fancy way of doing prices. I have the gap between price and the physical cost of constructing the unit. Okay, this is from a Journal of Economic Perspectives paper with Joe Jerko. And what you can see here is the places that don't build a lot are expensive, and the places that are the places that are expensive don't build a lot, and the places that build a lot aren't expensive, right? There's no denying the laws of supply and demand, right? If you're going to have a renewed demand for urban space colliding against a fixed supply of urban space, you're going to risk creating boutique towns that are affordable only to the wealthy. And we've seen this happen over and over again. Whereas in places like Austin, Raleigh, Las Vegas, Charleston, Phoenix, which build a lot, they remain affordable because they've unleashed the developers. And it's a sort of rich fact that, red state Texas does such a better job of providing affordable housing than blue state Massachusetts does. And they do so not because they have some great affordable housing policy, but because they just don't regulate development as much. This shows, declining permits in Manhattan, accompanied by rising prices. This is the area in which I think Jane Jacobs, who is a peerless observer of urban life, in so many ways got wrong. She looked at new buildings and saw that they were more expensive than old buildings, which led her to conclude that the way to promote affordability was to make sure that you don't build any new buildings to replace old buildings, right? This is not how supply and demand works, and you don't have to look any further than our own home district of Greenwich Village, right, which was affordable in the 1950s, and now townhouses start at $8 million, and you need to either be a hedge fund manager or an NYU professor to possibly live there, right? This does not mean that historic preservation districts are necessarily wrong, but it does mean that you can't pretend there's not a trade-off there. You can either preserve the past or you can build for the future. This is home prices and local land use regulation, nothing surprising here. And this is sort of a nice piece from a thesis that I supervised a couple of years ago. Here he uses the regression, the spatial discontinuity at the borders of areas that allow multifamily residential dwelling. And what he shows is that you have a clear, the areas become much whiter as soon as you stop permitting multifamily dwellings. Right, that you're actually, in some sense, that by restricting the amount of building, you're also making sure that you're creating a more racially separated world. Housing observations. So it's very hard for the federal government to mess with local zoning rules. Zoning rules are done at the most local level of American government, and it's very hard for the feds to do anything about this whatsoever. In fact, I will say that I've talked to Fed officials at least since the 1990s, and every Fed official I've spoken to for 20 years has wanted to do something to push back on local zoning controls. And none of them have figured out a meaningful way to do that. Secretary Carlson is currently enthusiastic about this, but he's not unique about this. Secretary Donovan was keen on this as well, as was Secretary Cisneros 25 years ago. But it's very, very hard to figure out how to do this from the federal level. At the state level, there are sort of two strategies that work, one of which is just overriding local land use controls, which Massachusetts does under certain circumstances by Chapter 40B, or providing financial incentives that work against local controls. That's done by Massachusetts 40R and 40S. Secretary Carson is currently thinking about figuring out some way to use HUD community development block grants to push back on local land use rules. I think it's hard to imagine that will actually work. Two other things which are also, I think, sensible. One of which is rethinking the home mortgage interest deduction. So the U.S. has a policy which privileges home ownership in the tax code in a major way. Economists also sometimes talk about this. Instead of it being the deduction, the fact that we don't tax you for the housing services provided by homeowners. But that if that's not natural to you, then just ignore it and just think about the home mortgage interest deduction, which we've actually lowered the cap on in the recent tax reform, which is actually one of the few positive things that came out of that. There are lots of reasons to push against the home mortgage interest deduction. It's wildly regressive. The work of Paterba and Sinai shows that families that are rich have about 10 times more benefit out of this than families that are middle income, meaning over 250K versus 40 to 75K. It subsidizes leveraging yourself to the hilt to bet on the vicissitudes of the housing market. It subsidizes buying and building larger homes, which means more energy use. It's hard to see that this is a really sensible policy. Moving away from this seems like also part of a sensible urban policy. So we think about, one way to sort of make sure that cities have a level playing field is to make sure we stop subsidizing suburban commutes by stop using generating tax revenues to pay for highways. Another way is to stop using the tax code to privilege moving away from cities. And it's important to remember the strong correlation between ownership type and structure type. More than 85% of single-family detached houses are owner-occupied. More than 85% of multi-unit dwellings are rented. When you say the American dream involves owning, you're basically telling people to move out of their urban apartments that they're renting and find a house somewhere in the suburbs. There's just no reason the federal government should be engaging in that kind of social engineering. Finally, the low-income housing tax credit, right? Should any housing supply-oriented policy be national in nature? And I can give a perfectly plausible explanation for why you need the low-income housing tax credit in highly restricted markets like New York or San Francisco or Boston, right, where the social value of housing may be far higher than construction costs. It's very hard to see that we should possibly be subsidizing housing in Detroit, where more than 90% of the homes are valued significantly less than construction costs, or for that matter in Houston, where whatever you subsidize is just, not going to have anything to do with the overall supply of housing, which is going to be driven by the private market. So really acting as if you're going to have one American housing market is absolutely just insane. And some policy that recognizes the fact that we have wildly different housing markets would be a much more sensible way to approach this. Finally, loser and winner regions, and I'm going to come to something about employment policies and social insurance policies that feels a lot like what I just said about housing policy. So America has always been a place with wild disparities in income across place. So the fact that some cities, San Francisco, New York, Seattle, have done very well while others have not, shouldn't feel new to you. In fact, in 1950, Mississippi was the poorest state in the Union, and there were 18 other states that had per capita incomes that were double that of Mississippi. Today, Mississippi is still the poorest state in the Union, and there is not a single state with per capita incomes that are double that, right? By and large, it's not that the variance has risen, it's shrunk, at least by many dimensions. But still, the nature of regional differences in income are different than they once were, in part because America feels like it's a much less fluid nation. Okay, and let me just give you a couple of facts that go along with that. One of which is declining American migration. For the 40 years before 1992, every year, right, we never had an inter-county migration rate below 6%. We've had an inter-county migration rate below 4%, a third less than that for all of the last 10 years. We are a much less fluid nation. When migration does occur, it's disproportionately of the skilled, especially from less skilled areas. So along here we have the college graduation rate for non-migrants. Here we have the college graduation rate for migrants. And you can see in those places that are least skilled in America, they're the ones that are shedding the skilled most frequently. So a model that says, I know what to do about those areas that are doing poorly, the West Virginias, the Detroits, they should just move out and go to New York. You know, I'm not unfriendly to that view, but it's still got the problem that as they're moving out, they're going to be shedding skilled workers and suffering even more strongly while they're doing it. So, you know, thinking that the only answer is out-migration feels like it's a mistake, at best a half answer, and that we have to think that we can have a better set of spatial policies than just saying you should just move out, especially since we know that restrictions on building in New York, San Francisco, and Seattle mean they're not going to be able to move. And that's some part of the declining migration. That whereas throughout almost all of America's history, we allowed housing to be built, whether or not it was bloom frame houses on the prairie in the 1830s or the tenements that were built in the 1890s in Chicago, right? We were great at building. For the first time, we have the most productive parts of America in which we've, you know, said that no one can build because of local land use rules. It's not that we lack land in Silicon Valley, it's just you can't develop that land because some parts of it have 60-acre minimum lot sizes, right? Other changes that are like this, there's a strong relationship between the change in the share of the population with a college degree and the initial share of the population with a college degree, let's say 1940 to 1960. So the education disparities across areas are getting bigger, and as I showed you earlier, education is so strongly correlated with regional success. And income convergence across metropolitan areas of Puma has slowed or disappeared entirely, right? Income convergence, and I'll show you this at the Puma level. This is 1980 to 2010, and this is probably showing more convergence that's real because of the measurement error that naturally creates income convergence. But income convergence was a deep fact, meaning that richer places had less income growth than poorer places. A deep fact of the U.S. from 1840 to 1980. And just when, you know, Robert Barrow and Xavier Sally-Martin made this a deep fact of our world, it kind of stopped working. And that's been true over the last 20 years, that it's been a real diminution of the fact that poor areas see their per capita income grow more quickly than rich areas do. At the same time that income convergence is stalled, we have this great, what I see as a national crisis, of the rise of not working, right? When I was born in 1967, 5% of prime-age males, prime age meaning 25 to 54, were jobless, right? As I creep towards, I don't know if your view on this is Austan, as we creep towards that 54-year thing, I'm finding that an increasingly offensive term. The prime age is 25 to 54. So 5% were not working in 67. For much of the last decade, 15% of prime-age males have not been working. A huge gulf. That gulf does not show up in the national unemployment rate. You can see that's come nicely down. We're at these deep levels. But you've still got more than 10% of the prime-age male population that has left the labor force. And it's not like they're better off or being productive in the way that many women who have left the labor force have. They're by and large fairly miserable, and I'll show you this later. That the fact that they've lost hope is not a sign that there's anything positive about this. This is, in my view, America's greatest unsolved social problem. This is the share of the male population that has been not working for 12 months or more. So that's gone up. And it has a profound geography, which is how it relates to urban policy. The epicenter of male joblessness is America's eastern heartland, which starts down in Louisiana and Mississippi, runs up through Appalachia, and then ends up in the traditional Rust Belt. Right? These are areas where much of these areas, joblessness rates are over 25%. More than 1 in 4 prime-age males are jobless in these areas. This is the same map for 1980. You know, the places that were high jobless then are higher now, but the levels were just so much lower. And this is these are the female numbers. I have to change the color code on this because the numbers are so much higher. But it doesn't look the same at all. It looks like a north-south regional divide rather than this eastern heartland. This eastern heartland stuff shows up with other social problems. These are opioid deaths, drug poisoning fatalities, which again seems higher in some parts of the West and in the eastern heartland. Incarceration rates, again, also higher in this eastern heartland. Now, just in terms of how you should think of human unhappiness or other issues, right? So a fact that I keep around in my mind is the share of men earning more than $50,000 a year who say that they're dissatisfied with their life, that's 2%. Okay? Share earning between 35 and 50, that's 4%. Share earning under 35, that's 6%. Share unemployed, share non-employed, that's 18%. Okay? A huge increase. And I can't look at figures like this. And if they're living alone, it's like 35%, right? And not thinking that inequality seems to me like a far less terrible thing than joblessness. That in fact, people who are working but lower income have a sense of social connection from the job, have a sense of purpose, whereas those people who are alone by themselves without jobs have none of that. They have no social connections, they're by themselves, and it makes me think at least that policies that privilege reducing income inequalities at the expense of increasing joblessness may be particularly problematic, especially in these parts of America where joblessness is particularly rife. And these areas are in fact quite persistent. So for those of you who remember, right, greatest hits of Blanchard and Katz, 1992, Brookings Papers on Economic Affairs, showing that basically there's no relationship between the unemployment rate in 1985 and the unemployment rate in 1975 across states, that if you remember that graph, forget that graph, okay? Because this is not working rates in 2010 on not working rates in 1980 across American Pumas. They're incredibly tightly correlated, and the coefficient is more than 1, right? So we have these permanent pockets of joblessness in the U.S. Now, I think this calls for targeting joblessness in the same way that we target housing. We need to have spatially targeted policies that take aim at this. Now, here's what I'm going to suggest. There's sort of 3 things. Reform social welfare policies like disability, food stamps, and housing vouchers in ways that privilege working more. Now, you can do this by either allowing people to just keep more of what they earn. So food stamps have a 30% tax on working. Section 8 housing vouchers have a 30% tax on working. Disability has a hard cap on working. All of them can be made more work-friendly, right? The work of Magnus Malmstad using Norwegian data shows that when you allow disabled people to keep more of their income, they work more. Now, that would be expensive unless you also want to tilt it. Right? So tilting it would mean we're going to take away from the base and give them more if they work more. Right? Your relative preference for just giving more and tilting depends upon your political proclivities, and I don't have any view on that. But there's a case for promoting work more, especially in areas where joblessness is higher, where at least our work suggests that joblessness is more sensitive to wages or other interventions. And the key point here is not that you're giving it there because its joblessness is higher. You're giving it there because the elasticity of joblessness, because the impact of these policies on joblessness is higher. So if you had a limited bucket of money to spend for employment subsidies, meaning bribing workers to go back to work or bribing firms to hire workers, you surely want to target that in places where it's going to yield the most bang for your buck. Right? That's what all basic economic formulas tell you. If we believe the numbers that suggest that the elasticities are larger in West Virginia than in Seattle, and in some sense it's hard to imagine that they wouldn't be, right? Once you get to 100% of the people unemployed, there's going to be nobody on the margin. Then it argues for doing more in terms of targeting and subsidizing employment in these areas with high joblessness levels that are more elastic. And I think at least that responding to local elasticities, recognizing that we do not have one labor market but many, is a much better rationale for incorporating place into policy than traditional stories like redistributing across areas for income tagging purposes or classic agglomeration economies. I will make one last point and then I'll stop, which is that if I'm calling for anything, right, it's a combination of having policies that treat cities fairly, having policies that don't artificially subsidize non-urban activities, that actually pay for infrastructure with the users that use it, that lean against local regulations that stymie growth, and that focus on promoting employment, particularly in places that are jobless. I think there's just a final argument for this, which is, cities are often depicted as being enemies of the environment. But in fact, the opposite is true. And if you're worried about global warming, then in fact, there's a good case for promoting density rather than pushing against it. I like to make this point by telling the story about how Henry David Thoreau burned down 400 acres of prime woodlands outside of Concord, right, because he was living surrounded by nature. And the point of this is that Thoreau, although he preaches a gospel of what a great thing it is to live surrounded by nature, he also did a great deal of harm to nature. And that's the lesson of that I take as being that we're a destructive species, and if you love nature, it makes sense to stay away from it. There's a this is carbon emissions located in different parts of Massachusetts. The places that look brown are green, the places that look green are brown. This is because of driving longer distances and living in smaller homes. I'm an economist. I believe people should have choices. When I started acquiring small children, I moved from here to about here, and I started doing almost as much damage to the environment as the road did. The point is, we shouldn't be subsidizing people to do that. We should be charging people with the social costs of their actions. We shouldn't be encouraging them to leave cities with things like the home mortgage interest deduction and things like subsidizing highways. So let me end with, and we certainly shouldn't have regulations that artificially restrict growth. These are the areas that are greenest. Okay, these are the areas that are brownest. The difference is primarily because of just weather. And the odd thing is that often environmentally supported local land use regulations that stymie growth are actually strongest in those areas where you want to promote the most development, right, which is coastal California. And just once, and the problem is if you stop development outside of San Francisco, it starts outside of Houston, it starts outside of Las Vegas. And when you have environmental impact reviews that only say what's the impact on the local environment, not what's the impact of the global environment, then you naturally lead to far too little development in the places that actually would be green for the US to build in. So let me stop there, and I know that Austin's going to disagree with me on everything. Let me hand the floor over to him.
Okay. Yeah.
Austan Goolsbee is the Robert Gwinn Professor of Economics. He previously served in Washington as the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors and a member of the president's cabinet under Barack Obama. His research has earned him recognition as a Fulbright Scholar and an Alfred Sloan Fellow. And Jon Stewart describes him as Elliot Ness meets Milton Friedman, and he has twice been named as a star professor by Business Week's Guide to the Best Business Schools. Join me in welcoming Professor Austan Goolsbee.
Okay, you want me to stand up or sit, or what do you think?
Whatever you're comfortable with.
Okay. Well, I think they only asked me to do this because way back in the day when I was an undergraduate, I was on the debate team, and my nemesis, actually I was more his nemesis, was the guy Ted Cruz, who's the senator from Texas. I used to beat up on that guy every week, and my partner and I were the national team of the year, and Ted Cruz was second, and 2/3 of the rounds that we'd have. I would needle him. I would this and other, and then round would end with Ted red in the face. How dare you say that? And I'd be like, oh, we got him again. And when this guy Beto O'Rourke ran against through a long story, they heard that I had that, and Beto O'Rourke called me. What advice do you have? I have to debate Ted Cruz. What should I know? One of Ted's signature things back then, carried forward to today. If you go watch the debate against Beto O'Rourke, he did it again, and I'm about to do it to you, which is they set the time, okay? Ed talked for 30 minutes, I talked for 30 minutes. He doesn't get to reply with what I said after he spoke. Then we go to the audience. So Ted will act totally reasonable, and then once it's clear there's nothing you can say after that, then he throws bomb after bomb so that you can't reply. Okay, so I appreciate you making Ed go first so I can throw bombs at whatever I want. With kidding aside, you got a master class there. Ed's problem was he only had 30 minutes, but he had 52 slides. So that's why he was talking fast. He was going to get through all the slides. But there were a lot of deep, you'd have to say it was more than just policy. There's a lot of philosophy behind several of the policy ideas that Ed had there. And you could feel Ed torn, the two parts of Ed being torn. When I was in the White House, I brought Ed in with a group of President Obama. Was unlike maybe some other presidents, he was relatively open to wanting to hear from people that were his critics or who had different views. And at one point, I brought Ed in, he sat in the Oval Office, and he talked to and debated with President Obama. And I understand after I left, he did it again. And he was exemplary in illustrating some of these tensions and why they're important. And some of those tensions are a conservative viewpoint that you could hear, regulation is killing us, the tax rates are horrible. They put a high marginal tax, food stamp, put a high marginal tax rate on work, and that's why nobody wants to work. Interspersed with we need to protect the environment, we must nurture our cities, we need infrastructure, we need education, anything that would improve urban education. He made a sentence, we should all be for that. Yes, we all should be for that, but we are not all for that, and that's what I'll get into in a moment. I think the theme that I would like you to bear in mind, maybe as I walk through some of my comments, are fundamentally, you have to decide for yourself, where do you think growth comes from? Where do you think innovation comes from? The way the United States got to be the richest major economy on earth, let's say. Luxembourg is still richer, and maybe Dubai or something, but of all major economies, we have the highest productivity and we have the highest income. How did that happen? There is a worldview that says growth comes from the absence of government, and that if you would get rid of the regulations and reduce all the taxes and have everybody pay their own way, the person's, each foot you drive in a rental car, you're gonna pay by the foot, you're gonna pay by the mile, you're gonna pay by the degree that you heat your house. That if you do those things, then growth will come naturally. And I think that the problem that you have, if that's your worldview, is you got to explain, why is it that the very richest places in the United States, the very cities that Ed is telling us are the glorious manifestations of human potential, there are virtually none of them located in places that have the lowest tax rates or the least regulation. Silicon Valley is in Northern California, which has always been a high regulation, high tax place to be. Silicon Valley is not in North Dakota. There is an island nation called Vanuatu, where there is no taxation of any kind on capital. The capital gain tax rate is 0. The corporate tax rate is 0. High income tax rate is 0. Sometimes I'll talk about the island of Vanuatu, and then if it's the billionaire crowd, they'll come out, where is this island of Vanuatu that that you're talking about? Why isn't Silicon Valley located on the island of Vanuatu? You know why? Because companies don't go to Silicon Valley because it's cheap. They don't go there because that's where there's no regulation, that's where no tax. They go there because they can't afford not to go there, because that's where the talent is. And the thing about talent is talent's expensive. And so government policy that involves raising some taxes and paying in investments, properly defined investments, in your people, in your infrastructure, those things, as I look at the world, I don't see how anybody can conclude those aren't by far the most dominant things that you must follow when you enact policies. And there are many individual things that Ed and I bet, would agree with on a lot. What should congestion fees be? And should they change the mortgage interest deduction to be a credit? Or should they change land regulations to try to encourage more affordable housing in urban areas? Should we invest in urban schools? All of those I think we're going to agree on. But the things where we're going to start to disagree are where the economist Ed bleeds over into the ideological Ed. Now, you may not know about Ed. He was a University of Chicago guy through and through, and came from the University of Chicago. And deep down in the Milton Friedman part of his soul, he would love to say, yes, look, let's invest in schools. But you heard him. He couldn't say that without saying, now, I'm not saying, there's a lot of evidence that just throwing money at the problem, that's not going to solve it. So we have to figure out a different way to do it. And my view is we don't have to figure it. We know what works, and we know what absolutely doesn't work. Okay, so spending more money on schools may not have the highest return. We know cutting the money that's going to schools has a massive negative return. And so as we walk through, I guess I would say, first, on cities, Ed's own paper, I consider a classic in the field, and I talk about it wherever I go and talk to city leaders, and a lot of times it'll be in Chicago. They asked me to speak. Rahm Emanuel, who was the chief of staff, became the mayor of Chicago, and he said, could you speak to the bondholders? There's some Chicago city bondholders meeting. And the day that they arranged this to speak, the night before, the city of Detroit declares bankruptcy. So the Chicago bondholders are furious. They're like, what? Are you going to declare bankruptcy? And I don't know anything about it. I mean, I'm just like an economist. They brought it. And my lesson for what cities succeed and what cities fail comes directly from Ed Glaeser's own work, which are, there are three factors that post-World War II explain cities that have succeeded decade after decade and cities that have gotten worse decade after decade. Number one is, what's the weather in January? So warm places have done better than cold places since the invention of air conditioning. Number two, one company, one industry towns do worse. The more specialized you are, the less diverse the entrepreneurial backbone, let's call it, of your business base, the worse you do. And the third is the places that have the highest human capital, the highest educated workforces do better. Okay, those are the three dominant factors. And if you look at those, I don't see how you cannot, it deserves more than just skimming over the point about education. That throughout the United States, we're now moving into an environment in which everybody philosophically agrees that we need to invest in education, but we're cutting financial aid. We're starving for resources. The community college system, which is the kind of the great unsung hero of education and training. We have the highest enrollment rates for 25-year-olds that have started college in the world, but our dropout rate is so much higher than everywhere else that we've fallen from the number one most educated 25-year-olds to like 20th or 25th in the world. And you know what the implications are down the road. We have to, in my view, put the focus on increasing the amount of money and resources. And yes, we can improve the business models, but even with no improvement to the business model, we know that the policy that we are on now, which is cut, reduce the funds, and hope that it works out and let each person pay their own way, doesn't work. I would say category two. Then if you think about healthcare or flexible work or maternity leave or the ability to take care of a sick parent or a kid, all of those are policies that have now been characterized as being highly partisan, that Republicans say, we don't need any of that. But you can't simultaneously think that the entrepreneurial base and the new business startups in your city are critically important for whether you succeed, while simultaneously opposing portable health care when you know perfectly well that one of the main determinants that keeps people from starting businesses, even more than whether they have to get an occupational license to be a cosmetologist or anything like that, is can you get health care and can you cover your family? And if you look at the labor force participation rate of men, it's been declining slowly since the 50s, as Ed said. Of women, it rose, it peaked out, and now it has been declining such that now women in the United States work less than their counterparts in Europe and in Asia, which never happened before. And the number one culprit, we have the least flexible labor market policies of virtually all advanced countries in the world. So what seem like social policies, my argument is those actually are entrepreneurship policies, and we should think of them in that way. Now, the last 2 points that I will say. One, Ed has given us a pretty compelling vision, let's call it, of cities as being the most economically productive places that we have. But cities only work where there are spillovers where spillovers are high, where we learn from each other. And Ed and others' own work show that it is precisely diversity within cities that lead to the biggest gains. And the notion that we would restrict immigration, that we would be making arguments at the national level that are kind of based on racial resentments or a desire that the United States would be more ethnically pure, in a way, they're crazy. So if you just think about the United States, we could either say this is our strength for the same reason that cities are the drivers of economic growth and productivity, precisely that they bring together people of lots of different views, and the interesting ferment is what generates economic growth. That could be true for the nation as a whole. The U.S. is a massively diverse place and historically always has been. Or we could be the 95th most pure nation on earth ethnically. And it must be deeply frustrating to be Steve Bannon or Miller or working in this White House where you're constantly thinking it's a horribly undermining thing for the United States that it's so diverse. Because that's what's wrong. If you look at the data, it's really quite not true. So if we could agree to invest in education, including more money as well as changing the business model, if we could agree, let us provide universal health care that is portable and not tied to an employer, that insurance companies can't just drop you if you're sick or if you have a child that is sick, that we would have more flexible labor market policies with either paid maternity leave or the ability to take time off or reschedule, and we could agree that those would contribute to growth, I think we would have that would be a great starting point. I don't think that most of the conservative wing would necessarily agree with Ed's diagnoses about trying to foster those things, or at least they might say higher taxes are worse than no matter what you say are the downsides of that, higher taxes are worse than that, so therefore let us cut the taxes. The last category that I will leave you with is, I hope we do not forget that in a worldview which is everybody should pay their own way, and the world should be oriented around user fees, there is one problem with that, which is there is a sizable, not small, sizable chunk of society who's not, they're on an island that is a very unpleasant place to be, and they are not connected. Some of those on that island are exactly the people that Ed talked about, who have been long-term unemployed. They might be disabled. They don't have a source of income. They are often alone and isolated. But think of, say, the 25 to 35% of the United States that does not ever buy anything on the internet. Okay, so here's just a small example. In my own research, we got data from an analytics company online to answer the question, what does inflation look like for people who buy online versus people who do not? Okay, so the consumer price index has shown inflation of about 2% per year. Now, not everything that people buy can be bought on the internet, of course. You know, you can't really see the doctor on the internet. You don't really purchase your house on the internet. But of those things sold online, the inflation rate is some 150 to 300 basis points, 1.5 to 3 full percentage points lower online than it is in the CPI. Okay, there's massive deflation online in the last 3 years. And it's like a special bonus to the kinds of people who shop online, who, I don't need to tell you, they have higher income. They're better educated. They live in cities. They already have the income advantages that we have seen in income inequality. It's just they also have massive price advantages too. And then if you start looking at the rise of market power of our employers, so the concentration in almost across the board, in almost all industries, has been a large increase in the concentration of ownership, simultaneously with a dramatic, unprecedented rise in the rates of profit of companies. The corporate profit share of GDP has never been higher, and the employee compensation as a share of national income has never been lower. They might be unrelated, but there are a lot of things in the economics that say they probably are related, or they easily could be related. And so I hope we do not forget that there are locations, cities, employees that are working for companies where the bargaining power of workers has gone way down, the concentration of employers has gone up. It's been an amazing time to be a big corporation or a high-income person in the United States for the last 35 years. It's been an unparalleledly great time. But there still is 25% of the country where that has definitely not been true. And all of these trends are going the opposite way for them. And the more we insist on everyone should just pay their own way, and wouldn't that work out better, you got to remember that a lot of the people will not be able to pay their own way. That's the recipe. Hey, why don't you just buy it online? You can get it for cheaper. Yes, that will work if you can buy online, and if you can't, it won't work. Now, Ed didn't say anything about universal basic income. And there was a time when we thought about maybe we make the whole thing about universal basic income. Let me say that while I'm a Democrat, I'm not convinced that universal basic income is as good as maybe its advocates want. So universal basic income has most vociferously been advocated by kind of Silicon Valley billionaires. And their argument is, our computers are going to be so amazing, our software is going to be so amazing that it's going to replace everyone's job. There's not anything that any of you people can do that our computer can't do, but we don't want to feel guilty about that. So how about we set it up where you will be given enough money to live, the universal basic income, and then if you want to go work and earn more than that, you can, but you would receive an amount that would kind of replace the safety net, and you'd get this income. I think three things about that. The first is that is a policy that is a break the glass policy, that once the technology has replaced us all and we don't have jobs, what should we do to keep ourselves alive? If only one person owns all the machines and makes all the money, we are going to have a policy of taxing that person to pay to keep everyone alive. But it's not a policy that would be enacted when the unemployment rate is 3.7%. Because in the places where they have tried it, the first thing that happens is there's a decent chunk of people who say, I'm going to quit my job because now I have a basic income and I don't need to work for it. And that makes it politically extremely controversial, because the policy that was designed to save you when you've lost your job, people feel totally differently when it's like, wait a minute, I just gave you a policy that enabled you to quit your job. And given the issues of labor force participation already, I think that's one that makes it hard to enact a universal basic income before the robots have replaced us. Number two, if there's some amount of redistribution that a rich society is willing to do, whatever, say it's $100 billion a year. Basically, what we have now is a system with means testing that is kind of like $20,000 a year to the 10 million poorest people in the country. The universal basic income is, let's take $2,000 a year and give it to 100 million people instead of $20,000 a year, give it to 10 million people. The implications of that for the very poorest are actually quite negative, or potentially quite negative. And that's why you see a lot of very hard people facing extreme hardship kind of questioning the policy. Wait, now hold on a second. Does that imply we're going to cancel all the stuff we have now to go with everybody gets $2,000? Which leads me to category three. Why does the safety net exist today? I think the safety net exists because in a rich country, we cannot deal, we are willing to pay not to have people showing up at the hospital and saying, I'm sick, I'm going to die, I don't have money, and to have them be told, oh, well, then you just have to die if you don't have the money. Or, my kid is starving, I don't have the money. We have food stamps. We have a series of things that prevent us from having to feel like that's a trade-off. I think if you switch to universal basic income, you will have people show up at the emergency room who say, I'm sick. And then somebody's going to say, well, you're supposed to use your universal basic income to pay for a doctor. And some share of them are going to say, well, I blew the money. I spent it on something, whatever. Now what do you want me to do? And the fact that we have a safety net now tells me that's not going to, replacing the safety net with just income, I don't think is going to work. Now, all of this said, I'm still fundamentally quite optimistic that in 50 years, let's say, we come back, that we will look at this period of American history with an awful, be like, oh man, that was awful. There was so much division and people hated each other and there were so many things going wrong. But we will look back and say, but we got back on. It was okay. And partly the thing that makes me feel that way is date from the time of the Hamilton musical, 1780, whatever, to today. We're at Brown, so I can say, take logs of that. Per capita income in the United States, take logs. So if it's a straight line, that says constant growth rate. It's a straight line. For the United States, it's a straight. We've been growing steadily at a robust rate since the 1780s. And what the pessimists are doing is saying, hey, the last 10 years of that doesn't look so great. Let's extrapolate that 10 years for 100 years and look at how poor we're going to be. And I don't see how you can look at that line and make that conclusion. And so the following thought, Warren Buffett, the rich guy and investor, was an Obama supporter in 2007, 2008. And I got to know him a little. And when he would come to the White House, he would have, sometimes we set up to meet or whatever, and he would always have a quiz. And like his quizzes would be, what do I think was male life expectancy the day he was born? Which are like, when is he born? I don't know when he's born. But one of his quizzes is, what do you think the Dow was in 1900? Okay, I didn't know there was a Dow in 1900, but there was. The Dow Jones Industrials existed in 1900, and the answer was it was at 50. The Dow was at 50. And imagine the list of why to be a pessimist from Brown was here. So we had this debate in 1899 here on campus at Brown. They're like, was the Harding administration there yet? No, they were later. Who was
1800 is McKinley.
But who was 1899?
1899 was still McKinley.
Oh, okay. This guy's everywhere. McKinley's sweeping the nation. This guy. So we're like, well, what do you think of the McKinley administration? And let me come from the future, like the Back to the Future guy, and show you everything that goes wrong from now to 2018. And like I say, you got World War I, you got World War II, the Holocaust, bank runs, hyperinflation, flu pandemics, Justin Bieber, and like every other thing to go wrong. And if they ask you, what's the Dow going to be in 2018, you're going to be like 40 or 80, between 40 and 80, somewhere in there. And how does the Dow, look, it can go down a lot if we're going to get in a trade war, but it's basically 25,000. How? After all the atomic bombs and all the stuff goes wrong, how did it get to 25,000? It's because the innovative capacity of the American people has proved unbounded. And we would do well to remember that and to invest in that, not to take it for granted and not just say, hey, if we get rid of all regulations and taxes, it'll fix itself. And I will leave you with the words of George Stigler from the University of Chicago, Nobel Prize winner. Did you know George? I never met him. He passed away right before I joined the faculty. Okay, I asked his friend said, George is the kind of person. I said, what kind of a person? George is the kind of person he'd wake up every morning and look at himself in the mirror and grade himself a D. And I was like, oh God, is he depressed? Is that what? No. He gave everyone else in the world an F, so he always had a smile on his face. Okay, I kind of feel that way if you look at our politics, at our economy at this moment. There are a lot of things you would not give a high grade to. But it really could be a whole lot worse, and in the end, I kind of think it's going to be fine. Okay, 29 minutes. So now we're to open for questions.
As Professor Goolsbee rightly points out, we have about a half an hour for questions and answers from the audience. We do ask that you try to clarify the substance of your inquiry, but we have microphones at both ends of the room. Feel free. Scott Gerber.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you for the presentation. I'm not an economist, so my question is going to be very basic, and it's about the idea of user fees for infrastructure. It makes sense to me. So my question for Professor Goolsbee is, what's your argument against it? And then my question for Professor Glaeser is there a more efficient way to collect them than at least I see when I'm on a highway trying to get into New York, and when you're on the George Washington, the morning rush, you wait 2 hours to give them $5. That just doesn't seem like an efficient way to do it. So those are my questions. Thank you.
Yeah, look, my wife's from New Jersey. Actually, I met our first date was at Walden Pond. That was a picture. I was like, wait a minute, I have a photo of me standing next to Robin at that Walden Pond right there, pretty much right there. The Garden State Parkway, you get in and you literally pay 15 cents, and then you drive 2 miles, and then the next county, boom, you pay 15 cents. Okay, here's my only thing. I don't object to user fees. I object to only user fees. Okay, so envision a world in which the only highways, every highway, you pay by the mile, everyone pays their own way, and there's a wide group of people who don't have the money, they can't travel on the road. Okay, then in that, you're going to change society. Now, expand it out from highways to the internet. Okay, so the same thing comes up. Should somebody be able to charge more to offer you super internet and charge somebody else a different price, or keep them off of the internet, or healthcare, or education, or any of the others? My view is that there are some things that fundamentally have an important externality in what we would call in our world of tying the nation together as one body. And the national highway system was one. And on the margin, having some toll roads or charging to try to prevent congestion, I can see having a value. But I don't think that we should neglect the fact that if everything goes to the charging model, there's going to be wide swaths of the country that can't afford to participate in whatever is the current level of economic prosperity, and that makes me nervous.
Well, it's a thought experiment that it sort of seems it's an interesting one, right? I mean, of going to a 100% user fee model for everything. I'm not sure I was particularly proposing that, but I'm willing to follow it along for the course of argument. I did carve out pretty clearly a view that infrastructure that was particularly targeted towards the poor, or any public services that were charged to the poor, needed to follow a different pricing model. I did say that, and I certainly stand by that. I think the idea that we're going to make the buses that carry around poor people or pay for themselves is madness. And indeed, I want to emphasize that, in fact, in the world of real user fee financing or real congestion fee financing, the loudest advocate for this policy over the last 20 years is Mayor Ken Livingstone of London, whose sobriquet, let you not forget, is Red Ken Livingstone, right? Because in fact, he is a die-hard socialist. And the reason for that is he recognized that by charging the rich people who drive around London in their cars more, he will clear up space for the poor people who take buses, and he will help pay for those buses. right? So the view that somehow or other user fee financing is anti-poor feels like it is completely missing the point to me, right? The point is to get efficient use of roads. The point is that when people get on those roads, they internalize a bit of the cost of what they're doing rather than just creating congestion willy-nilly or screwing up the environment or whatever else they're doing. So do we need something to make sure that poor people can still connect? Of course we do. The vision of a world in which we have no state and we have no role of government is not a vision that I find remotely sensible. In fact, in general, I hope we move on from a world in which we argue everything about more government, less government, which is an argument I've listened to that argument for 40 years and I find it pretty sterile, to an argument in which we ask, how can we make the government that we have function better? And I think that's the argument that I'm interested in having on schooling, is not whether or not we should. I'm not against spending more on schooling. I don't have a particularly strong view about it. I'm interested in taking whatever dollars we're spending and making sure that we're delivering more for the smallest children that we have. And I'm certainly not in favor of cutting schooling spending. So
Yes, look, that's fair. That same idea, I guess I would raise, we should think about that with regulation too. So one great bugaboo is regulation can limit and destroy growth. And there's no question that it can. At the same time, I wrote this thing, and it might come out this Sunday or the next Sunday in the New York Times, about the Chicago River. So if you go to the Chicago River, it's glorious. I mean, it's really, on a nice day, it's amazing. And then they built an Apple store, and there's kayakers and architecture cruises, and there's the Trump Tower right there, the fourth tallest building in America, where the condos are selling for $3 million each. The Chicago River was a stinking eyesore that was literally poisoning the residents of Chicago it started several of the big cholera epidemics in Chicago, because there were no rules really about environmental pollution, and the industry is just dumping crap in the river, literally, as well as radioactivity and chemicals. And the thing that unlocked the private sector all around the river was that the Clean Water Act, the federal government forced them to clean up the river. And once the regulations did that, it unlocked a bunch of private sector growth, which existed because there were these externalities. There's an interesting paper by some guys at University of Illinois about public parks in cities, in which they say, how much are public parks worth to houses around the parks? And the answer is, if the city is investing in public safety, they're worth a ton. And if the crime rate is too high, they're actually a negative value. Nobody wants to be near a park unless the park is safe. But if the park is safe, then it drives up the value of all the private sector around it. Those seem to me like examples where you can definitely find regulations that help, that actually encourage private sector growth and encourage the rise of value in cities. And I feel like stupid regulations we know are damaging, but we also know that there are a lot of regulations that aren't stupid.
Now, Austan, did you miss this part of my talk? So let me just, I went through this, which I think is a much better example of your point, which is, in fact, cities are full of externalities, positive and negative, and unless they are regulated, I mean, there's no such thing as a sensible libertarian in a city, right? Cities are full of externalities that require some form of management. And much more important than like even the Chicago River, right, was this graph. Was the point that, in fact, until you had regulations that forced people to connect to the sewers, they kept on fouling the water and they kept on dying to vast amounts. This is what the Metropolitan Board of Health did, right? It imposed regulations on owners that actually required them to use the sewer system to not create stuff. This could not be more right. There are smart regulations and there's stupid regulations, right? The right answer is not always regulate less or always regulate more. It's to be smart about it, and that's what sort of a sensible discussion is on this.
Before we move on to the next question, could both presenters just make a conscious effort to speak into the microphone a little bit for posterity's sake? So it's being recorded.
Okay.
Thanks. Yeah. Next question.
Hi, professors. Thank you so much for coming to talk to us. So my question is actually a little bit related, so I guess I'll just push you both a little bit more on it. So generally speaking, Professor Goolsbee, I certainly agree that the government has a role to play in ensuring some role in education, some role in healthcare, ensuring some kind of standard of living. But generally, I think more than most Democrats, I don't like regulations because to me, they're more often than not regulations that benefit the wealthy. That there's this narrative that the government steals from the rich and gives to the poor, but more often than not, it's actually more so the other way around, that most people realize that the government steals from the poor and gives to the rich. And I think the home mortgage interest deduction that you mentioned is a very good example of that. To me, another example of that is actually the government funding of roads. So my question to you, Professor Goolsbee, is do you think that the way the system stands now, is that a subsidy for the wealthy? And I'm not talking specifically about public transportation, so I think buses are not for sure, but specifically creating and maintaining roads, is that a subsidy for the wealthy? My question to Professor Glaeser, would you push what you were saying a little bit farther and advocate for the privatization of roads? Not necessarily bus systems, so government could fund bus systems that operate on privately owned roads. Would you think that that's the most efficient, the best solution to what you're talking about? And I think there's like good ways and bad ways to do that. So I'm also from Chicago, worked at Booth for a little while actually. So we had like a terrible system with the private parking meters, where there's just like an absolute monopoly on those. But I think there's ways to create competition. So I think there's ways to do it. But would you advocate for privatization of those roads?
So for anybody who's not from Chicago, what happened in Chicago is they were desperate for money. The previous administration was exiting, and so they sold all the parking meters, the right to collect the parking, to an investment bank. I believe they got $1 billion, which they spent the net present value of all the future parking revenue they spent in 1 year. So they collected $1 billion, they spent it, and then it turns out if you're granted a monopoly, you tend to raise the price. So they raised the prices. Everybody's like, "What? This is outrageous! How did this happen?" They're like, "Actually, it's going to be this way forever." And since then, we've had high prices. Though this might be Ed's nirvana. They're charging high parking fees, so nobody's going to drive. They probably had an increase in their bus transportation. I would say I could find the building of highways regressive. That's kind of your argument, is that it's regressive. If we looked into it more, now if the main thing funding the highways is a tax on gasoline, then I guess I wonder, are we maybe moving to something like a user fee? So there might be some more efficiency reason in that. I certainly think that the building of the highway system and the low cost of fuel in the U.S. compared with all other countries for sure encouraged people to move out to the suburbs. So that chunk of Ed's analysis about, let's call it the inefficiency of moving out of so many people moving to the suburbs, and the ways that that's accentuated inequality, that part does feel regressive to me. I guess the last thing I think that's a little, it's probably not an irony, it's just interesting. To the extent, Ed showed you that graph of, here's where Obama's people screwed it up.
It was under Bush, wasn't it?
First it was under Bush, but the second is in the places where at the close of Ed's talk, he said, look, in whether it's West Virginia or eastern Montana or these places that are rural, predominantly rural, have been kind of left behind as cities have grown as fast as they have, in a way that ends up being advocating a policy which is about, well, let's try to make it cheaper for places there. And if you put in congestion fees in cities, in a way it on the margin pushes people out of cities to these other places. So it might also be worth thinking about what the externalities are in that case. But you might convince me if we sat down and looked at the numbers that that's regressive.
So three points. One of which is just certainly depends upon which which roads we're talking about in some sense. I mean, ASILA actually, the subsidizing of the Northeast Corridor, if not done through some form of user fees, is actually wildly regressive as well, because actually Northeast Corridor riders are actually extremely rich. So that may still be something that's worth investing in. But and I think that the problem is you don't actually want to charge on the margin for people to use trains, because the marginal cost of providing it isn't that high relative to which is why I think the nicest model for trains, for paying for trains, is the Hong Kong MTR model, where they build skyscrapers, the public transit company builds skyscrapers on top of train stops, and they essentially cross-subsidize the trains with the real estate that they earn on top of it, which I think is a particularly beautiful model. I will say, actually, I have to agree with one thing, and so it is true in some sense that Austan has peered into my soul and is right that there is a certain Chicago thing lurking inside of me. That being said, I don't think the right answer is for the government to go away at all, and because unlike Austan, who has to roughly be on one side of the political aisle, I don't have to do that, because Austin's kind of got to have an opinion on lots of things. There are most issues in which there's no way he's going to draw me into a debate on portable health insurance in any way, shape, or form. I don't know anything about that. I'm not going to opine on that. But because of that, I have the freedom to choose causes that I think satisfy two of my desires, one of which is to be relatively on the side of freedom, and the second is to be relatively on the side of poor people. Both of these things I like a lot. So I tend to choose issues like fighting against restrictions on building in high-income areas that make it harder for poor-income people to live. I tend to be against restrictions that make it hard for poor people to start up forms of entrepreneurship, because I get to pick and choose, because I get to choose those issues, and I think it's that's you're absolutely right. That is where I skew. Last thing I'm sorry, I forgot to answer the question of how to make the taxing more efficient. What an idiot I am. So in fact, we can do this with Singapore actually now has GPS-based charging. So they can charge you based on time of day, where you're going. Now, there's a certain Big Brother spying on you aspect of this that should make you anxious, but certainly they can do so in a way that is wildly efficient and wildly, doesn't involve anybody slowing down for anything. Now, privatization of roads. So you saw the Chicago example. It's funny, I was in Indiana doing an event where we yet again came up as the textbook example of how to do privatization badly, right? In terms of public services, privatization is not a free lunch. Sometimes it efficiently cuts costs. Sometimes it leads to various forms of abuses of the public sector, right? Private companies have all sorts of incentives to corrupt and do things that are wrong. On the other hand, they have things that go the right way. So I think the source of wisdom on this is, of course, Deng Xiaoping, right, who correctly said it doesn't matter if a cat is black or white as long as it catches mice when talking about privatization. And the right answer is we need to be smart about this. Right? We need to actually understand when we're going to get cost savings out of privatization that overcome whatever else goes wrong on this. And there's some areas in which privatized roads just make a lot of sense, particularly when it's adding extra infrastructure. So if you're telling me you're going to build some extra automated vehicle line between, I don't know, Milwaukee and Chicago, and you've already got a fair amount of capacity between these, and you don't really have the public money to do it, but you're going to have some kind of deal where the private sector is going to do it, and then they're going to charge these autonomous vehicles. I think that may be something that's worth doing, as long as we've handled the competitive bidding right. But we should never pretend that it's easy, right? Because it's you still need to have public companies overseeing it, and they can still get played and abused in lots of different ways.
You've been waiting patiently?
Yeah. Okay.
That was his polite way of saying we got to be more succinct in our answers. Okay, we will.
Okay. My question is, I'd love to dig in a little more into the discussion of universal basic income, because one really interesting theory that I just came across is the idea of a combination carbon tax and dividend system. The dividends kind of map to speaking to an idea of universal basic income, but the how it's funded is based on a carbon tax rather than general fund. So, and I think this is really interesting to me because it's talking not about removing the safety net and replacing it with a universal basic income, but more just a way of mapping our economy a little more closely to kind of environmental concerns. And that's just an interesting case study, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about, sorry, kind of lost my train of thought.
Well, look, it's an interesting idea. Carbon tax used to pay for a dividend / universal basic income, let's call it.
Yeah.
I guess I'm used to thinking of those, let's split them in two, and let's think about what's the nature of the dividend, and what's the nature, should there be a carbon tax? Now, there have been people that have looked at What if you cut the payroll tax to encourage employment and funded that with a carbon tax? The idea about making people pay for pollution is in the spirit of Ed's, the people who create the costs. If you're damaging the environment, you should pay, so that you, that's no different than the guy who's dumping whatever it is in the Chicago River, because he's not taking into account the fact that it's ruining the city, it's ruining the neighborhood. My stuff about universal basic income, I think, is primarily not an objection, maybe an objection of what's the form of the dividend. Okay, so I can understand having a carbon tax. If you use it as universal basic income, I think it will have the feature that it will lead a bunch of people to drop out of the labor force. I think it has the potential to, unless there's going to be a big upping of the taste for redistribution, it has the potential to be of the form person used to get a fair amount of money because they were very, very low income or had terrible disability or something like that. And it's going to be a tendency of like, well, what are you complaining for? You got a universal basic income. And then, like I say, I still don't think that'll save the safety net. There are some states. So in the state of Alaska, they have an oil. They make money off oil, and they have a dividend that they pay out. If you've been a resident in Alaska for some amount of time, you get it. And I think their thought is sort of this, obviously not to address climate change, but to say, if they're going to be drilling for oil in our environment, let's have something tied to it. Where do you come down on these?
Oh, I'm like
Tax
you, but more
exchanges.
so. So I think
Yeah.
I think your argument for separating the two is exemplary. I mean, I think the whole tying them together is just taking something that's a pretty bad idea like universal basic income and making it look really good by tying it to something that's a really good idea, which is taxing carbon, right? So taxing carbon is something that, for exactly the reasons Austan said. I mean, like most economists, I think it's something absolutely we should be doing, and then we should figure out how to spend it in some way that actually makes sense. So you just heard me say that I thought that the ocean of unemployed men is a massive problem for the United States. I don't see a world in which universal basic income doesn't make that problem potentially much worse.
Got it.
Right? That in fact the income effects of throwing money at these guys will lead them towards working less. We saw this in the income experiments in the 1970s. We saw negative effects, and those effects will be larger today than they were in the past. And in some sense, UBI is a way for the tech sector to wash away their guilt, right? And it's a highly materialist fallacy in some sense. Maybe that like somehow or other, if we throw money at people who are jobless and sitting on the couch, they'll feel good about themselves. And why is that? I mean, we have no evidence to suggest that that's the case. Whereas the right thing to do is to figure out some way to make the incentives for job creation to be stronger. And that doesn't come from UBI, that gets reversed by UBI.
Interesting. Got it. Thank you.
Thank you.
This
Hi,
that would have been a really bad debate for us to have.
Yes.
Hi, thank you for coming. So my question is broad and also a little cliche, but nevertheless something I think is interesting. Can both of you speak about an experience in which a strongly held viewpoint of yours has either altered or evolved, and what facilitated that?
I'll tell you. Well, certainly. So Austin's right that through my early 20s, I unquestionably, as a Reagan era kid, I went to the U of C. My libertarian views were pretty strong. I would say I still think freedom's a pretty good thing, but you start being engaged with urban governments. The streets need to be clean, right? The schools need to function. Safety needs to occur. Libertarian has no answer for any of those problems. Has no way to make those problems better or to really give an answer for lifting up the poorest, the most disadvantaged, and protecting them. So I think unquestionably, I like to think that I've still remained skeptical about where government gets it wrong, but there needs to be robust, capable government at all levels to take care of things. Now, the one area where I'm not stopped, and here, maybe I'll need a Austin a little bit. I do think that I see a lot more to love in most mayor's offices than I do in most presidencies, right? That in fact, there's a lot to love about these governments that are just on a daily basis answering problems, dealing with potholes, dealing with fires, trying to make the lives of their citizens better and being fundamentally responsive to it. Whereas there's a lot that's ugly in Washington, right? Even under the best of administrations.
Austin, you've never changed your mind on it?
No, I've changed my mind. I'm just, the question was it's such a grand level, and everything I can think of is like something small or what seemed like they'd be relatively petty. It's kind of not worthy of the question. I guess lately, sort of my biggest reorientation of my thinking is sort of sad. Is sort of pessimistic, which is, I guess I inherently sort of took for granted that in the making of policy and something that it was getting more, not more fact-based, but it was more, we were actually arguing about content, and that much of our discussion of our politics was about something that I fundamentally thought I kind of understood. And the last couple of years, I've come to think that maybe the people like us, or the policy-oriented community, maybe they had their golden era, and it might be done. Because I sort of think the Trump people came in arguing, they asked, sometimes if you watch, I have this long-standing improbable friendship with Sean Hannity, that we'll fight each other, but we actually get along. And so I was on Hannity, and he interviewed Donald Trump in the campaign, and he said, you've been criticized for not having specifics, but you say you're going to repeal and replace Obamacare. What specifically would you replace it with? And Donald Trump's answer was something fabulous. But that was it. That was and so in a world where they say we're going to do something fabulous, and we're not going to get a score, we're going to cut taxes and not get a score, and blah, 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 the Democrats will be back. And I don't know if it'll be in 2020 or sometime they'll be back. And then they're going to want to do a bunch of stuff. And then the people like us are going to say, but let's make sure it works. Let's make sure government works in the details. And now I kind of think politics, maybe it's much more tribal than I thought it was. Because I think those Democrats are going to be like, why should we play by the rules? What the hell? They didn't play by the rules. We're going to shove it down their throat. So I guess I've gotten a little pessimistic on that side, and I feel like that evolved for me. That's a tough one for me.
So we have a little bit less than 5 minutes, but apparently 2 questions remaining. So I propose that we hear both questions and then let the presenters reply. So you
Have
can
a
go first.
question debate, and then the debate.
Thank you both for coming. My question is primarily based on something Professor Glaeser said in discussing overriding local zoning. I'm wondering if you think the supply and demand model is an oversimplification of housing markets, especially in high-demand urban areas, where there may be an arbitrarily high demand, such that constructing new housing and allowing for sort of denser development will incentivize people to buy second homes, things like that, and not actually sufficiently tackle the housing affordability crisis in cities.
Thank you. And we'll also hear from Daniel before they reply.
Yeah, so this is a question about education policy, and Professor Goolsbee sort of briefly talked about how we know that cutting from schools will definitely not work, and we should try to spend more on it. But in terms of an urban education system, I went to a public school in Los Angeles, in LAUSD, and it's clear that over time we've spent even more money every year, and nothing is getting better. So I was wondering if you had any comments, and Professor Glaeser too, about teachers unions and also the policy of putting students in schools based on their zip code, and the whole public schooling system in general, and its failures as a system rather than just how much money we put in it, because I think there's systematic failures there. It's just your commentary about it. Thank you.
Feel free to reply.
Okay, we each got one, so that'll be fine.
You got the teachers' unions.
I got that little. I've already got education policy. I caution you, if your mentality is we shouldn't expand education funding if we can find anything wrong with any school, that's just a recipe not to expand education funding. And that will be a big mistake. So you can feel like we spend more and more every year, but we don't get anything. That's not true. It's not true. If you're in bad schools, if you drop out, you do worse than if you don't drop out. And if you go on to community college, it's true that we have a crisis of college readiness, let's call it. And so the economists are who look at that. I'm not an education economist. Among education economists, there are big divisions between ones who are hyper negative on teachers unions and say the presence of teachers unions undermines a bunch of things, and there are others who say, and a lot of those groups say we should promote charter schools and school choice is critically important. And on the other side, they tend to emphasize there are big fixed costs in providing schools, and so if you allow cream skimming, you can have the whole network fall apart. If you take only the best students out and you leave only the expensive ones, and they can't cover the fixed costs, you can get in a situation where the legacy teachers union schools have massively higher costs than everywhere else, and so you'll see their costs spiraling upward. But that's kind of like the death spiral in a healthcare situation. So I'm certainly not averse to education reform. I advocate it, but I don't think it's accurate to say that because there are problematic urban schools, we should boycott and withhold our funding until the teachers unions go away or there is no inefficiency. I think the data doesn't back that up.
And actually, I think you guys should be very, very proud of Race to the Top. I think there's actually a lot that you did in terms of education reform that was actually this is more of a state issue, as you know, not a national, for K through 12 at least. But a lot of states have done some interesting stuff. So I've got to ask whether or not I think supply and demand is no reciprocation. I just don't. And I think that it's not, there may be various sort of funny and interesting things about how various forms of supply perturb demand, but it's a very second order thing. The way in which supply and demand fails us is that in many cities, we're just so far away from a world in which we could possibly build enough housing to promote real affordability, right? So in the 1920s, New York City built 100,000 units a year, right? And it stayed affordable then because it just built enough. It's impossible to imagine going there now. And so then we're in a world in which we've sort of given up on the image of what real affordability is. And real affordability is any person can come to a city and find a reasonable apartment to rent at a reasonable price, right? And we've given up on that vision, which has always felt to me like the right vision. Instead, we say there's a select group of people that we're going to randomly manage to give these precious few number of affordable units that we've given to them. And I see that. I understand that. I understand the desire that you've given up on one, you've got to move to the other. It does sometimes create absurdities. Like my highly NIMBYist hometown had a celebration about 7 or 8 years ago because they had managed to construct, you guessed it, exactly one affordable housing unit. And somehow or other that was something that they should be proud of. But I do see that there's a case to be made for some form of targeted affordable housing units to create some degree of mixing of rich and poor in areas, and maybe that's a third best response to this. But ultimately, it's never a real replacement for real affordability, which ultimately only comes when you build enough stuff, and you build enough stuff that's targeted towards the middle end of the market. But I want to end by just sort of making just a final point, because Austan raised the issue of diversity and immigration. And I want to give him a chance to respond if he can, so that I'm not. But one of the reasons why I have been skeptical of government is my father grew up in Nazi Germany and my grandfather grew up in the Tsar's Russia, and consequently I at least have some examples in my past of governments that didn't always put the interests of their citizens first. And I think my view has always been that immigrants are good for cities, cities are good for immigrants, and just from an ethical point of view, I can't look at myself in the mirror and think that I want to deny any other human being the right to be an American citizen. That I sort of believe fundamentally we may, for various pragmatic reasons, have decided that we have to put limitations. But at least as something to aspire for, those words of Emma Lazarus on the Statue of Liberty are something worth believing in. And I certainly then basically come down on the view that America should be open to all. At least that's the vision that I would favor. So I wanted to know whether or not, so Austan, I wanted to know if you would embrace that in your official capacity as the spokesman of the Democratic Party here. And if not, I just wanted to make sure, just to make it clear,
Look,
in fact, I was not in any sense on, I want to make sure which side of the issue that I'm on this side, not on the
My selection criteria, which is I knew that I was trying to put Ed in the uncomfortable position, but he's happy to just saw it off and be like, I'm not with those people who think that. My view is what we should select on in immigration is very much, do you want to become an American? Do you embrace the American spirit? Do you embrace American values? Do you, if you read the Constitution, Declaration of Independence, do you agree with this? Or are you just coming here to work? I think that Americanism, orientation to Americanism, it must be deeply frustrating again to the Steve, and I did not put your name. I said to the Steve Bannons and Steve Millers.
I just wanted to make it clear
and
where I
presidents.
stood on this issue.
It must drive them crazy that the Constitution itself, Article 1, talks about the process of naturalization. That the United States is a place where you can become an American. That's not a, you don't, to become Swiss is a weird thing, because primarily it's about being born in Switzerland, and like, was your family from Switzerland? And the America has not been. So I believe on most things, Ed and I will always end up agreeing. And so I've been trying to get us some purchase.
But one other one, because the world is far away. So I want to
Yeah.
end on his optimism. So I think the big point about cities is that cities have been working miracles by connecting people and creating these collaborative chains of creativity for thousands of years, since Socrates and Plato bickered on an Athenian street corner. I want to just say one thing on this, is that age of collaborative miracles is not over.
Yeah.
It's still around us, and it's looking ahead. And given the track record of people connecting and working together, we must keep that optimism.
I'd like to take this opportunity to thank again both of our presenters and to thank all of you.
That message is so important.
Please be on the lookout for additional political theory project events in the future. Subscribe to our Facebook. There's also a brief reception in the lobby. Please join us for snacks and beverages.
You would take it.